They say blood is thicker than water, but when my mother slapped me in front of 15 people and told me I was dead to this family, I learned that blood can also drown you. And 8 weeks ago, my mother demanded I pay $30,000 for my brother's wedding without asking me first. When I said no, she didn't just get angry, she declared war. What she didn't know was that I'd spent my entire life being invisible in my own family. The dependable daughter. The one who paid the bills, made the sacrifices, and stayed silent. But that slap. It woke something up in me. So when my brother's wedding day arrived, I didn't just show up to watch. I showed up with the truth. And by the time the ceremony was over, my mother's perfect day was in ruins. My brother was walking out on his own wedding, and a family secret, 40 years in the making, had finally exploded. They wanted me to pay for this wedding, and I did, just not with money. Stick around, because what I'm about to tell you will change how you think about family forgiveness and the price of finally choosing yourself. My name is Anna Miller. I'm 38 years old, and for most of my life, I've been the kind of person who says yes before anyone even finishes asking. I work as a senior financial analyst at a consulting firm. Downtown, good job, steady income, the kind of life that looks successful on paper. But if you asked me when I last felt truly happy, I'm not sure I could tell you. It was a Saturday morning in late September when everything changed. I was in my backyard watering the white carnations my father planted 5 years ago, just months before he died. He used to say these flowers were special because they didn't demand attention, they just bloomed quietly, season after season, whether anyone noticed or not. I always found comfort in that. The garden was the one place I felt close to him anymore. The phone rang. Unknown number. Most people would ignore it, but I knew better. It was my mother. Evelyn changes her phone number every few months, something about spam calls, though I suspect it's more about control. She likes knowing that I'll always answer even when I don't recognise the number just in case it's her. So I took a deep breath, set down the watering can, and answered. "Your brother's getting married in 8 weeks," she said. "No, hello, no, how are you? Just straight to business. You'll help, right?" The word help should have been my first warning. With my mother, nothing is ever as simple as it sounds. But I assumed she meant the usual. Maybe she needed me to pick out flowers, or help address invitations, or drive her to the venue for a walkthrough. "Of course, Mum," I said. "What do you need?" There was a pause. Then she said very matter-of-factly, "You'll pay for it. The venue, the catering, the photographer, everything. Mark and Jessica are just starting out. They can't afford a proper wedding. I already told everyone you're covering the costs. The deposit for the venue is due next week." I froze. My mind raced trying to process what I'd just heard. $30,000. Maybe more. And she'd already told people, relatives, friends, the venue itself that I was paying. Not that I might help. Not that she'd ask me. That I was paying. It was a done deal in her mind, announced to the world before I even knew about the engagement. "Mum," I said slowly, trying to keep my voice steady, "you didn't ask me." "I'm telling you now," she replied, as if that settled it. "Mark needs this, Anna. He's starting a family. This wedding will show people they're serious, that they're building something real. You have a good job. You don't have children. You can afford it." Something inside me cracked. Not loudly, but definitively, like ice breaking under weight it was never meant to carry. For 38 years, I'd been the dependable one. The one who paid Dad's medical bills when Mum couldn't. The one who loaned Mark money for his car, his apartment, his life. The one who stayed quiet when I was overlooked at Christmas. Forgotten on my birthday, thanked only in passing when I rescued everyone from their emergencies. But this was different. This wasn't an emergency. This was entitlement. "I'm not paying for it, Mum." Silence. 5 seconds that felt like 5 minutes. Then her voice turned cold, sharp as a blade. "I already told everyone. You'll embarrass this family if you back out now." I looked at the white carnation still dripping water from the hose. I remembered my father's last words to me in the hospital. "These flowers bloom in silence, Anna. So should your strength. Don't let anyone tell you quiet means weak." "Then, I guess I'm embarrassing the family," I said, and I hung up. My hands were shaking. My heart was pounding. I stood there in the garden, the phone still in my hand, waiting for the fear to crush me. But instead, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt awake. I didn't know that one word no would cost me everything I never had. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my living room with all the lights off, staring at the white carnations I'd brought inside and placed in a vase on the coffee table. The house was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old floorboards. My phone sat face down on the cushion next to me, vibrating every 20 minutes with calls I didn't answer. Mum, Mark, Mum again. I knew what they wanted. I knew what they expected. And for the first time in my life, I didn't care. But sleep wouldn't come because the memories wouldn't stop. I was 8 years old the first time I learned what my mother meant by family. Mark had a fever that spiked to 103 in the middle of the night. Mum was panicking, pacing the hallway, trying to get the fever down with cold washcloths. She came into my room and said, "Anna, Mark needs your bed. Yours is closer to the bathroom." I nodded half asleep and climbed out. She didn't ask if I minded. She didn't thank me. She just stripped my sheets and remade the bed for my brother while I stood there in my pajamas clutching my stuffed rabbit. I ended up sleeping on the floor of the hallway, curled up on the cold hardwood with a thin blanket I pulled from the linen closet. I remember shivering all night, hoping Mum would notice and bring me a pillow, maybe even invite me to sleep in her room. She never did. The next morning, she stepped over me on her way to check on Mark and said, "Good girls take care of their brothers. That's what family means." I was 8, and I believed her. By the time I was 16, I'd already learned that my future was less important than Mark's present. I worked 2 jobs that summer, one washing dishes at a diner on the weekends, the other shelving books at the library after school. I was saving every dollar for college. I had my eye on a scholarship, but I needed to show I could cover part of the tuition myself. My application was almost complete. I left it on the kitchen table, waiting for Mum to look it over. She'd promised she would. But when I came home one afternoon, tired and smelling like grease from the diner, I found Mark standing in the driveway next to a brand new silver sedan. He was grinning. Mum was beaming. She turned to me and said, "Isn't it perfect? Mark needs a car for his future. He's got college visits coming up, job interviews. He can't be taking the bus forever." I looked at the car. Then I looked at my scholarship application, still sitting on the kitchen table, buried now under a stack of mail. Unread. I didn't say anything. I just went to my room, closed the door, and cried into my pillow so no one would hear. The next week, I picked up a 3rd job. But the memory that haunts me most happened when I was 25. Dad was dying, stage 4 lung cancer. The treatments weren't covered fully by insurance, and the bills piled up fast, $47,000 in 3 months. Mum couldn't pay. Mark was fresh out of college, barely making rent. So I emptied my savings account. All of it, every penny I'd been putting away since I was 16. I told myself it didn't matter. Dad mattered. The night he died, he was so weak he could barely speak. But he held my hand, looked me in the eyes and whispered, "You deserved better from us, sweetheart. I'm sorry I didn't protect you." I didn't understand what he meant then. I thought he was delirious from the pain medication. At the funeral, Mum stood at the front of the room and thanked everyone for coming. She thanked the hospice nurses. She thanked the pastor. And then she turned to Mark, put her hand on his shoulder and said, "Thank you for being so strong and present during your father's final days. You made him so proud." I was standing 3 feet away. I'd been at the hospital every single night for 3 months. I'd held Dad's hand when he took his last breath, but she didn't see me. Or maybe she did, and I just didn't matter enough to mention. 2 weeks after the funeral, I went to Dad's workshop to pack up his tools. That's when I found it, a small tin box, tucked behind a shelf labelled in his handwriting. For Anna when you need it. Inside were 17 letters. My letters, the ones I'd written to Mum from college when I was lonely and homesick and desperate to feel connected to her. I'd written about making the dean's list, about my first day at my internship, about the friends I was making and the life I was building. I'd poured my heart into those letters, hoping she'd write back. She never did. But Dad had kept every single one, and beside each one he'd written small notes in pencil. Showed Evelyn. She read it and cried, but she won't write back. I don't know how to help her love you the way you need. On the last letter, where I'd asked if he was proud of me for making Dean's list, he'd written in bold letters, "He is, I am, always." I sat on the floor of that workshop and sobbed for 2 hours. I finally understood. Mum wasn't incapable of love. She was incapable of showing it. Now, 5 years later, I'm sitting in my living room with those letters spread across the coffee table. I understand her. I do. But understanding doesn't erase the pain. My phone buzzes again. This time, it's Mark. I pick it up, stare at his name on the screen, and feel the old pull the instinct to answer, to explain, to smooth things over. But then I hear Dad's voice in my head. "You deserved better." And I set the phone back down. For the first time in my life, I choose silence over people-pleasing. Some debts are paid in silence. Others are paid in absence. I thought choosing silence would buy me peace. I was wrong. 3 days after I hung up on my mother, they came to my house. I was making coffee in the kitchen when I heard the knock, sharp, insistent, the kind that doesn't wait for an invitation. I already knew who it was before I opened the door. Mum stood on my porch with her arms crossed, her face set in that expression I knew too well, the one that said she'd already decided how this conversation would end. Mark stood beside, her hands shoved in his pockets, looking everywhere except at me. And behind them, half hidden as if she wished she could disappear entirely, was a young woman I'd never met. "This is Jessica," Mark said, his voice tight and nervous. "My fiancé." Shucked. Jessica was 28, though she looked younger in that moment, small and pale, her hands clasped protectively over a stomach that was just beginning to show. 4 months pregnant, I'd learn later. With twins. Her eyes darted between me and my mother like she was trying to anticipate which direction danger would come from. She wouldn't look directly at me, and I recognized that look immediately. It was the same one I'd worn for most of my life, the look of someone trying to earn their place, trying to be small enough not to cause problems, trying to prove they deserved to be there. My heart broke for her before anyone said a word. "Can we come in?" Mum didn't wait for an answer. She walked past me into my living room and sat down on my couch like she owned it. Mark followed, guiding Jessica gently by the elbow. The girl looked terrified. I closed the door and stayed standing. "What's this about, Mum?" "We're here to talk sense into you," she said flatly. "You made a mistake on the phone the other day. We're giving you a chance to fix it." Mark shifted uncomfortably. "Anna, this is really important. Jessica's family, they kind of cut her off when they found out about the pregnancy. We really need this wedding to go well, to show people we're..." He hesitated, searching for the right word, legitimate. I looked at Jessica, who was staring at her hands, picking at her cuticles. She hadn't said a single word. Mum leaned forward, her voice taking on that practiced tone she used when she wanted to sound reasonable. "Jessica has no family support. No job. Mark's salary barely covers their rent. These babies are coming in 5 months, whether anyone's ready or not. This wedding isn't about flowers and cake, Anna. It's about giving these children a future. It's about showing the world that this family takes care of its own." It was a masterful guilt trip. I'd give her that. She knew exactly which buttons to push duty, family, innocent children. But I also knew what she was really doing. She was using this frightened young woman as a human shield, a prop in her argument, a way to make me the villain if I refused. I ignored my mother and spoke directly to Jessica. Is this what you want, a big wedding? Jessica's eyes flicked up to mine for just a second. Her lips parted, but before she could speak, Mum cut in sharply. Of course it is. Every bride wants... I'm asking Jessica, I said, not taking my eyes off the girl. The room went silent. Jessica looked like a deer caught in headlights. For one brief moment, our eyes met and I saw it. Not joy, not excitement, not even hope. I saw terror. Pure, raw terror. And I understood. She wasn't here because she wanted a big wedding. She was here because she'd been told this was the price of being accepted. This was the test she had to pass. Before Jessica could answer, Mum stood abruptly. We're not here to debate, we're here to finalise the arrangements. The deposit is due in 4 days, Anna. I need your credit card information. No, I said quietly. Mum's face flushed. Don't be childish. This is your brother. This is family. Then, maybe family should have asked instead of announced. Mark finally spoke, his voice strained. Anna, please, I'm asking you now. We need help. Jessica needs this. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a man who'd never learned to stand on his own 2 feet. 32 years old and still waiting for permission to live his life. Does Jessica need this, Mark, or does Mum? He opened his mouth closed. It looked at Mum, then back at me. He had no answer. They left 20 minutes later, Mum slamming the door hard enough to rattle the picture frames on the wall. Jessica hadn't said a single word the entire time. As they walked down my driveway, I watched through the window. Jessica glanced back once, and the look on her face haunted me for hours afterward. But the day wasn't over. At 10 o'clock that night, there was another knock on my door, softer this time. When I opened it, Mark was standing there alone, soaked from the rain, shaking. I know what she does to you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I've always known. I crossed my arms. Then why didn't you ever say anything? He broke down right there on my porch, tears mixing with rainwater. Because I'm weak. I'm 32 years old and I'm terrified of her. He wiped his face with his sleeve. When I was 7, I wanted to give you my favourite toy car for your birthday. The red one Dad gave me. But Mum stopped me. She said, Mark, Anna is strong. She doesn't need toys. But you need to be protected. Because I almost lost you once. I didn't understand what she meant. I still don't, but I never forgot the way she said it. Like I was already halfway to the grave. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. What are you saying, Mark? I'm saying she looks at me sometimes like I'm already dead. Like she's just waiting for me to disappear. And I can't handle that look. So I stay quiet. I do what she says. And I let you take the hit because... His voice cracked. Because you're the strong one. So you'd rather I feel dead than risk disappointing her? He sobbed openly. I'm sorry, God. Anna, I'm so sorry. Help me. I don't know how to get out. I looked at my little brother, broken and desperate, on my doorstep, and felt something shift. Not sympathy, not forgiveness, but clarity. I can't save you, Mark, I said quietly. But I can show you the door. You have to walk through it yourself. He stared at me, nodded slowly, and walked back into the rain. I closed the door on them. I didn't know I'd opened one for myself. The email arrived on a Thursday morning. Subject line, family meeting, your presence required. Question. It was from my Aunt Carol, my mother's older sister, but I knew Mum had dictated every word. The meeting was scheduled for Saturday afternoon at Carol's house. No explanation, no agenda, just the time and an ominous closing line. We need to discuss your recent behaviour and its impact on the family. I should have ignored it. I should have deleted the email and gone about my life. But something in me needed to see this through. I needed to look them all in the eye and not flinch. When I arrived at Carol's house, I knew immediately I'd walked into an ambush. 15 people were seated in a circle in her living room, aunts, uncles, cousins I hadn't seen in years. And in the centre, standing like a judge at the bench, was my mother. The only face I didn't recognise at first was an older man in a grey suit sitting quietly near the window. Then I realised it was Reverend Tom, the minister who'd married my parents 40 years ago. He'd aged, but his kind eyes were the same. Mum gestured to an empty chair in the middle of the circle. "Sit down, Anna." I sat. My heart was pounding, but I kept my face neutral. My hands were shaking under the table, so I pressed them flat against my thighs, where no one could see. Mum stood and addressed the room like a prosecutor delivering an opening statement. "I've called you all here because my daughter has decided to abandon her family in our time of need. I sacrificed everything to raise her. I put her through school, gave her every opportunity, supported her when she had no one else. And now when her brother needs help, when he's starting a family of his own, she's turned her back on us." Heads nodded around the circle. Aunt Carol murmured, "It's shameful, really." Uncle Robert added, "Family comes first. That's what we were taught." I said nothing. I let them talk, let them judge, let them paint me as selfish, ungrateful, cold. Every word confirmed what I'd always suspected. They'd never really seen me. They only saw the role Mum had assigned me, the dependable daughter, the endless well they could draw from. After 20 minutes of this, Reverend Tom stood. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a bell. "Evelyn, I need to say something." Mum turned to him surprised. "Of course, Reverend." He looked at her for a long moment before speaking. "I was there the day you married John. Do you remember what your mother did?" Mum's face went pale. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Tom continued, his tone gentle but firm. "She didn't come to your wedding because you married a poor man. You stood at that altar in tears, and afterward you made a vow not to John but to yourself. I remember because you told me. You said, 'I will never make my children feel they have to earn my love.'" The room was silent now. Every eye was on Reverend Tom. "But, Evelyn," he said softly, "that's exactly what you've done. You've made Anna pay for love her entire life. And when she finally stopped paying, you brought her here to be punished publicly. That's not family, that's cruelty." Mum's face flushed deep red, not with shame, but with rage. She turned on him. "You have no right." "I have every right," Tom said calmly. "Your husband asked me to watch over Anna after he passed, and I've been watching. I've seen what you've done to her, and I won't stay silent anymore." Mum's hands were shaking. She turned to me, her eyes blazing, and before I could react, she crossed the room and slapped me hard across the face. The sound cracked through the silence like a gunshot. My cheek burned. My vision blurred for a second. But I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I didn't even move. I just looked at her, really looked at her. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't looking for approval. I wasn't looking for love. I was just looking at a woman who'd been so consumed by her own pain that she'd forgotten how to see her daughter. Reverend Tom stepped forward and placed a hand on my shoulder. His voice was steady. "Your father asked me to watch over you after he passed. I'm sorry I failed him, until now." I stood slowly, touching my burning cheek. "You didn't fail him, Reverend," I said quietly. "You honoured him." I walked out. No explanation, no defence, no apology. I just walked through Carol's front door and into the pouring rain. Behind me, I could hear voices rising, shock, confusion, someone crying. But I didn't look back. The rain soaked through my clothes in seconds, cold and cleansing. It washed over my face, mixing with the tears I didn't realise I was crying. But they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief. That slap didn't break me. It freed me. I spent 3 days alone after the slap. I didn't answer the phone. I didn't check my email. I just sat in my house touching the bruise on my cheek every so often to remind myself it had really happened. that my mother had struck me in front of 15 people, and not one of them had stopped her. The bruise faded from angry red to purple to a sickly yellow-green, and with each stage of healing, I felt something inside me calcify, not into bitterness, into clarity. On the 4th day, there was a knock at my door. Soft, hesitant. I almost didn't answer. But something made me look through the peephole, and I saw an elderly woman I hadn't seen in over a decade. Aunt Rose, my father's younger sister. I opened the door, and she looked at me with such sadness that I nearly started crying right there. "I heard what happened," she said quietly. "May I come in?" I let her in. She was 70 now, smaller than I remembered, her hair completely white. But her eyes were sharp and kind. She carried a worn leather photo album under her arm, like it was something precious. We sat at my kitchen table, and she placed the album between us. "There's something you need to know about your mother," she said. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the album to a page near the beginning. There, yellowed and faded, was a photograph of a baby boy I'd never seen before. He was tiny, wrapped in a blue blanket, his eyes closed peacefully. "His name was David," Rose said. "He was your mother's first son, born 2 years before you." I stared at the photo, my mind struggling to process what she was telling me. "I don't understand. Mum never said—" "He died at 6 months old. SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome." Rose's voice was steady, but her eyes were wet. "Your mother held him for hours after he stopped breathing. She wouldn't let the doctors take him. She kept saying, 'He's just sleeping, he's just sleeping.' When they finally took him from her arms, something inside her broke. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. Why didn't anyone tell me?" Rose looked down at her hands. "Because your mother couldn't. After David died, she couldn't even say his name. When you were born 2 years later, she was terrified. She convinced herself that if she loved you too much, if she let herself need you, the way she'd needed David, she'd lose you too. So she pushed you away. Not because she didn't love you, Anna, because loving you felt dangerous." I sat back in my chair stunned. 38 years. 38 years of feeling invisible, and it was because of a brother I'd never known existed. But Rose wasn't finished. Her voice cracked as she continued. "There's more. The night David died, I was the one driving. Your father was out of town for work. Evelyn had a panic attack in the middle of the night. She couldn't breathe, thought she was dying. I drove her to the hospital, and I hit a pothole, a bad one. The car jolted hard. David was in the back seat in his car seat. When we got home an hour later, he wasn't breathing." Rose's tears fell freely now. "The doctors said it was SIDS. They said the jolt from the car had nothing to do with it. But Evelyn always wondered, did I cause it? Did I kill her baby? She never said it out loud. She never accused me. But she looked at me differently after that night. And I let her. God help me. I let her, because if she blamed me, maybe she wouldn't blame herself." I reached across the table and took Rose's hand. It was cold and papery and shaking. "I've watched her destroy herself for 40 years, Rose whispered, "and I've watched her destroy you, all because none of us could face the truth that it was nobody's fault. It was just a terrible, senseless tragedy." We sat in silence for a long time. I thought about my mother, young and broken, holding a dead baby, and deciding that love was too dangerous to risk again. I thought about Rose carrying guilt that wasn't hers to carry. I thought about my father caught between a wife who couldn't heal and a daughter who couldn't understand. And I thought about Mark raised as a replacement for a ghost, never knowing why his mother looked at him like he might vanish at any moment. We were all prisoners of a grief that had never been named. 2 days later, I was having lunch with a colleague when I overheard a conversation at the next table. A woman, in an event coordinator's uniform, was venting to a friend. "We've got this nightmare client," she was saying. "Miller wedding. The mother keeps insisting her daughter will pay, but we haven't received a single dollar. Not even a deposit. Policy is clear: no payment 48 hours before the event means automatic cancellation. I froze coffee cup halfway to my lips. My mother had never paid. She'd simply told the venue I would, and she'd been so confident I'd cave under the pressure, so certain I'd rescue her at the last moment, that she hadn't even bothered to secure a backup plan. I set my coffee down carefully and pulled out my phone. I texted Rose, "Can you come over tonight?" When she arrived, I told her what I'd overheard. She looked worried. "What are you going to do?" I thought about David the baby who died 40 years ago and haunted us all. I thought about Jessica terrified and trapped. I thought about Mark desperate to please a mother who'd never be satisfied. And I thought about myself finally free. "I'm going to give them the wedding they deserve," I said quietly. "Built on truth, not lies." Rose studied my face for a long moment, then she nodded. "Revenge isn't loud, it's patient." The invitations arrived on the same day, which felt like fate playing games. The first came in the morning mail, a thick, cream-coloured envelope with my name printed in elegant script. I opened it carefully, though I already knew what was inside. The wedding invitation was formal and expensive, printed on cardstock, so thick it could probably survive a hurricane. There was no personal note, no "we hope you can make it," or "it would mean so much to have you there." Just my name, the date, the time, and the location. Grandview Hotel. Saturday, October 14th, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It was the kind of invitation you send to a distant relative you're obligated to invite but don't actually want to see. The second envelope arrived in the afternoon, slipped through my mail slot while I was at work. I almost missed it. It was small, plain white, the kind you buy in bulk at the drugstore. My name was handwritten on the front in shaky blue ink. No return address. I opened it, standing in my kitchen, and a single card fell out. The message was brief. "Please come. I need to talk to you. Tuesday, 2 p.m, Rosewood Cafe. Please don't tell Mark or his mother. Jessica." My first instinct was suspicion. Was this a setup? Another ambush orchestrated by my mother. But something about the handwriting stopped me, the way certain letters tilted, the way the ink had smudged slightly, like the writer's hand had been shaking. This wasn't calculated. This was desperate. I went. Rosewood Cafe was a quiet place on the edge of town, the kind of spot where people went when they didn't want to be seen. I arrived 5 minutes early and sat in a corner booth facing the door. Jessica came in exactly at 2, scanning the room nervously, before her eyes landed on me. She looked thinner than when I'd seen her at my house 3 weeks ago, her face pale and drawn. The pregnancy was more visible now, a small, round bump under her oversized sweater. She slid into the booth across from me without ordering anything. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly. Her eyes kept darting toward the door like she expected someone to burst in and catch her. "What's going on, Jessica?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a folded document, sliding it across the table. "I need you to read this." I unfolded it. It was a prenuptial agreement, draft form marked with red ink corrections from a lawyer. As I read, my blood went cold. All marital assets remain solely with Mark Miller in the event of divorce. Jessica Chen waives all rights to marital property, including the family home and any inheritance from the Miller family. Evelyn Miller, mother of the groom, shall have primary visitation rights to any children born of this marriage and must be consulted on all major decisions regarding said children's upbringing, education, and medical care. I read it twice to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding. "Jessica, this gives your mother-in-law control over your children. This isn't a prenup. This is a custody agreement written before you're even married." Jessica's hands were shaking. "I know, I haven't signed it yet, but she keeps pushing. She says if I don't sign before the wedding, she'll..." Her voice broke. "She'll make sure I never see my babies." She hired a lawyer who explained that because I'm unemployed, have no family support and no resources, no judge would give me custody if Mark and I divorced. She said I'd be lucky to get supervised visits. I felt rage rising in my chest, hot and fierce. She said that to you, but... Jessica nodded, tears spilling over. She also told me something else. She said, "You're just a vessel for my grandchildren. Don't forget that." She said it while Mark was in the room. He didn't say anything. He just looked at the floor. I took a slow breath, trying to control my anger. Does Mark know about this prenup, about what she's doing? He knows. He told me we should just sign it to keep the peace. He said once we're married, it won't matter, that his mum will calm down once the babies are born. Jessica wiped her eyes with her sleeve. But I don't believe that. I think she'll get worse, and I don't know what to do. I have nowhere to go. No money, no family. If I leave Mark, I lose everything, including my children. I reached across the table and took her hand. It was cold and small, and I could feel her pulse racing. You're not signing that document. But if I don't, you're not signing it, I repeated firmly. And you're not marrying into this family until Mark proves he can stand up for you. Not to keep the peace, not to make his mother happy, to protect you and your children. Jessica looked at me with wide, frightened eyes. What are we going to do? I thought about David, the baby who died 40 years ago. I thought about my mother trapped in grief she'd never processed. I thought about Mark too weak to protect the woman he claimed to love. And I thought about these two babies not even born yet, already being used as bargaining chips. We're going to make sure everyone knows the truth, I said, not to hurt them, but to save you. And those babies, Jessica's voice was barely a whisper. Will you help me? I squeezed her hand. I'm going to do more than help you. I'm going to make sure your daughters never have to fight for their worth the way I did. Jessica managed a small, shaky smile through her tears. I came to ruin a wedding. Now I had to save one. The morning of the wedding, I woke at 7 with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. There was no anxiety, no second-guessing, no knot of dread in my stomach. Just a quiet, settled sense that today would change everything, and that whatever happened, I was ready. I made tea and stood at the kitchen window, watching the early light filter through the white carnations in the garden. They were blooming beautifully this year, thick and full, the way Dad always said they would, if you just left them alone and let them grow at their own pace. I wondered if he'd be proud of what I was about to do, or if he'd be disappointed that it had come to this. I dressed carefully in a simple navy blue dress, Dad's favourite colour. I'd bought it specifically for today. Nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention. I wasn't here to make a scene. I was here to let the truth speak for itself. I pinned a single white carnation to my lapel, fixed my hair and checked my phone. 3 messages were waiting. The first was from Reverend Tom, signed R. He had the recording from the family meeting ready to go. The second was from Jessica, ready, J. She'd recorded everything, every threat, every cruel comment, every moment Evelyn had revealed who she really was. The third was from Aunt Rose. I'm here, Rose. She was already at the hotel waiting. Everything was in place. I picked up the framed photo of my father from the bookshelf, the one where he was standing in the garden, smiling at the camera with dirt on his hands and joy in his eyes. I whispered to it, I hope I'm doing the right thing, Dad. Not for me, for the ones who come after me. Then I set it down, grabbed my keys, and left. The drive to Grandview Hotel took 20 minutes. By the time I arrived, the parking lot was already half full. I sat in my car for a moment, watching people stream into the building in their wedding finery, smiling and chatting like this was just another celebration. They had no idea what was coming. I walked inside and immediately spotted my mother. It was 10 in the morning, and she was already in full command mode, moving through the venue like a general inspecting troops. She adjusted a flower arrangement that was perfectly fine, snapped at a server for standing in the wrong spot, and reviewed the timeline with the event coordinator with the kind of intensity usually reserved for surgical procedures. Everything had to be perfect. Everything had to be controlled. I stayed back observing. And that's when I noticed there wasn't a single white carnation in the entire venue. Roses, peonies, orchids, all in shades of blush and cream, but no carnations. She deliberately excluded Dad's favourite flower, even on a day that should have been about family, about love, about new beginnings. She was still running from him, still running from grief she'd never let herself feel. I was standing near the entrance when an event coordinator approached me, clipboard in hand and worry written all over her face. "Excuse me, are you Miss Miller, Anna Miller?" "I am," I said. "Why do you ask?" She shifted uncomfortably. "Well, we're supposed to receive final payment today before setup is fully complete. Your mother assured us you'd handle it by noon. I just wanted to check in and see." "It's 10:30, I said calmly. "You'll know by noon." Her face fell, slightly confused by my tone. I walked away before she could ask anything else. At 2:00, with the ceremony just 2 hours away, I went to find my mother. She was in the bridal suite, not with Jessica, but alone adjusting her outfit in the full-length mirror. She was wearing a pale gold dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She looked elegant, composed, in control. She saw my reflection before she saw me. "You came," she said, her voice cold and clipped. "I'm surprised you had the nerve after humiliating yourself at the family meeting." I stepped into the room and closed the door behind me. "I came to witness, Mum, not to celebrate." She turned to face me, her expression hardening. "This day is the perfect. I've worked for months to make sure everything is flawless. Don't you dare ruin it." I looked at her, really looked at her. And for the first time, I didn't see the woman who'd slapped me, or the mother who'd ignored me, or the prosecutor who'd put me on trial in front of my family. I just saw a woman who'd been so afraid of losing control that she'd lost everything that mattered. "I won't have to ruin it, Mum," I said quietly. "You've already built this entire day on a foundation of lies. It'll collapse on its own." For just a second, I saw a flicker of fear in her eyes. She didn't know what I meant, but she felt it. The ground shifting beneath her. "I just hope, when it does," I added, "you finally see what you've lost." I turned and walked out before she could respond. Behind me, I heard her call my name, but I didn't stop. I had nothing left to say to her, because the scene was already written. She just didn't know she was the main character. I found a seat in the 5th row, far enough back to observe, but close enough to see everything clearly. The venue was filling up with guests in their finest clothes, chattering and laughing, completely unaware that they were about to witness something far more memorable than a wedding. Aunt Rose was seated 3 rows ahead of me. She turned, briefly caught my eye, and gave me the smallest nod. Reverend Tom was near the front, his face calm and composed, a leather folder resting on his lap. Everything was in place. 4:00 came and went. Then 4:15. Guests were getting restless, checking their phones, whispering to each other. My mother appeared from a side door, her face tight with stress, and spoke urgently to the event coordinator. I could see the panic barely contained beneath her composed exterior. At 4:30, the flower arrangements finally arrived. A team of workers rushed them in, setting up vases and centerpieces with hurried efficiency. I watched my mother inspect them from across the room, and I saw the exact moment her face went white. She grabbed the florist by the arm and pulled him aside. Even from where I sat, I could hear the sharpness in her voice. "These aren't what I ordered. I ordered roses, blush roses, and cream peonies." The florist, a young man with a tablet in his hand, looked genuinely confused. "Mum, we received a change request this morning from the bride. She specifically requested white carnations for the entire venue. We have the email here, if you'd like to see." "Jessica." My mother's voice could have cut glass. She whirled around, scanning the room, until she spotted Jessica near the back entrance in her wedding dress. Jessica stood very still, her hands folded over her growing belly, and for the first time since I'd met her, she didn't look like she was trying to disappear. She looked terrified, yes, but she also looked resolute. My mother started toward her, but the event coordinator intercepted, whispered something urgent, and gestured toward the seated guests. There was no time to fix it now. Everyone was waiting. The white carnations, my father's favourite flowers, the ones my mother had deliberately excluded, now filled every corner of the room. They were everywhere, and there was nothing she could do about it. I smiled to myself. That was Jessica's doing, her first act of defiance. And it was perfect. The ceremony finally began at 4:45. Guests rose as the processional music started, but something was wrong. Instead of the soft, classical piece my mother had selected, Pachelbel's canon, predictable and safe, the speakers suddenly blasted Gloria Gaynor's I Will Survive. The opening notes rang out loud and unmistakable, and for a moment no one knew what to do. Some guests laughed nervously, others looked around in confusion. My mother's face turned scarlet as she frantically signalled to the DJ, slashing her hand across her throat in a universal gesture to cut it off. The music stopped abruptly. The DJ, a young woman with bright purple hair, looked mortified. "I'm so sorry," she called out. "The playlist was switched somehow. I don't know how that happened." But I knew. And so did Jessica, who caught my eye from across the room and gave me the tiniest smile. Whispers rippled through the crowd. What a disaster. Who planned this? I've never seen anything like it. My mother stood rigid near the front, her hands clenched into fists, trying to maintain her composure while her perfect day crumbled piece by piece around her. The ceremony continued awkwardly. Mark and Jessica exchanged vows, though Jessica's voice shook so badly I could hear it from where I sat. She didn't look at my mother once. She kept her eyes on Mark, who looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, unsure whether to jump or step back. After the ceremony, during the cocktail reception, my mother finally took the microphone. She'd regained some of her composure, her smile fixed in place like armour. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her voice steady and warm. "Today is a testament to family, to sacrifice, to—" The speakers crackled. Her voice cut out. And then, clear as a bell, a recording began to play. It was her voice. But these weren't the words she'd just spoken. These were words from 3 weeks ago in Aunt Carol's living room, surrounded by family. "Anna owes this family everything. She's nothing without us. If she won't pay, she's dead to me. Family means sacrifice, especially from daughters." The room fell into stunned silence. My mother stood frozen at the front, the microphone still in her hand, her mouth slightly open. Guests turned to each other, confused, uncomfortable. Someone whispered, "What is this?" Reverend Tom stood up slowly from his seat near the front. His voice was calm, clear, and carried through the room without a microphone. "I think, Evelyn, it's time for some honesty." Every eye turned to him. "That recording," he continued, "was from a family meeting I mediated last week. Anna isn't here because she refused to fund this wedding. She's here because she refused to fund a lie." My mother's face drained of colour. She looked around, wildly searching for me in the crowd. When her eyes finally found mine, I didn't look away. I just sat there calm and still, my hands folded in my lap. I didn't lift a finger. And that's when they realised I didn't need to. The silence after Reverend Tom's words was deafening. My mother stood at the front of the room, her face drained of all colour, the microphone hanging uselessly in her hand. Guests shifted in their seats, uncomfortable, whispering to each other in confusion. I could feel their eyes flicking between my mother and me, trying to piece together what was happening. Then the projection screen lit up. Everyone turned. The screen had been set up for a wedding slideshow, pictures of Mark and Jessica's relationship, childhood photos, all the sentimental moments that were supposed to make everyone cry happy tears. But that's not what appeared. Instead, it was a video. Shaky phone footage, the kind you record secretly when you don't want someone to know they're being filmed. The first segment showed my mother sitting in what I recognized as Mark's small apartment. Jessica must have been holding the phone recording from across the room. My mother's voice was clear and sharp. If she won't sign, she's not the right woman for this family, Mark. I didn't raise you to be weak. A real man protects his assets. Mark's voice quieter, uncertain. But Mum, it seems extreme. Evelyn cut him off. It's not extreme. It's necessary. Unless you want to end up like your father, too soft to protect what's his. The video cut to a second segment. This time it was just audio playing over a black screen. My mother's voice again, but on the phone with someone else. I need full custody rights documented in the agreement. Yes, I understand that's unusual, but she has nothing, no job, no family, no resources. It should be easy to prove she's unfit if they divorce. I'm not taking chances with my grandchildren. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone said, "Oh my God." The third segment was the worst. It showed my mother standing in a kitchen looking directly at Jessica, who must have been holding the phone at waist level. Evelyn's face was cold, her voice matter of fact. You need to understand something, Jessica. You're carrying my grandchildren. That makes you useful. But don't mistake useful for irreplaceable. You're a vessel for my family's future. Don't forget your place. The screen went black. The room erupted in whispers, shock, outrage. I stayed perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, watching my mother's world crumble. Mark stood abruptly from his seat at the head table. His face was pale, his eyes wide and glassy with unshed tears. He stared at the blank screen, then slowly turned to face our mother. You said you were protecting me. His voice cracked, barely audible over the murmuring crowd. You said everything you did was for my future. My mother opened her mouth, but nothing came out at first. Then desperately, Mark, I can explain. This is out of context. I was just trying to, No, Mum. Mark's voice grew stronger. For once in my life, I'm seeing it clearly. He walked to the front, his steps slow but deliberate, and took the microphone from her trembling hand. She didn't resist. He turned to face the room full of guests, all staring at him in stunned silence. I need to say something, he began, his voice shaking. I'm 32 years old, and I've never stood up to my mother. Not once. I watched her break my sister for years. I stayed silent because I was terrified of losing her approval. He paused, swallowed hard, and continued. But today I realised something. My sister didn't ruin this wedding. She saved my life. Because if I married Jessica under these conditions, with these lies hanging over us, I'd be trapping her in the same prison I've lived in my whole life. And I can't do that. I can't do that to the woman I love. I can't do that to my children. He turned toward the back of the room toward me. Our eyes met. Anna, he said, his voice breaking, thank you. You didn't ruin my wedding. You woke me up. Tears streamed down his face. He reached up, unpinned his boutonniere, a white rose my mother had chosen, and set it deliberately on the table. Jessica appeared at his side, still in her wedding dress, her hand reaching for his. He took it, and together, without another word, they walked down the aisle and out of the hall. The doors closed behind them. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, Aunt Rose stood. She was 70 years old, small and frail-looking, but her voice carried with surprising strength. Evelyn, she said quietly, I need to say something I should have said 40 years ago. Every head turned toward her. Rose's hands were shaking, but she kept speaking. The night David died, I was driving the car. You had a panic attack. John was out of town. I was rushing you to the hospital. I hit a pothole, a bad one. The car jolted hard. When we got home, David had stopped breathing. Her voice broke, tears spilling down her weathered cheeks. The doctors said it was SIDS. They said the jolt had nothing to do with it, but you always wondered, didn't you? Did I kill him? Did that bump in the road stop your baby's heart?" My mother made a sound, half sob, half gasp. "I've carried that guilt for 40 years, Rose continued, "and I watched you punish yourself. I watched you punish Anna. I watched you punish Mark, all for a tragedy that no one caused. SIDS means no one's fault, Evelyn, but we've all been living like someone had to be blamed." Rose looked directly at my mother, her eyes fierce through her tears. "I'm done letting you use my guilt as an excuse to destroy your family. And you're done using David's death as a reason to control everyone around you." My mother collapsed into a chair, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs I'd never seen her cry before. Guests began to leave quietly, awkwardly whispering as they filed out. Within minutes, the room was nearly empty, and in that empty hall, only 3 women remained bound by secrets broken by truth. I drove home that night alone. Aunt Rose had stayed behind with my mother, who was still sitting in that chair crying into her hands, like something inside her had finally broken open. I didn't say goodbye. I just walked to my car, got in, and drove the 20 minutes back to my house in complete silence. The week that followed felt surreal. Friends called people I hadn't spoken to in months, saying they'd heard what happened. "You're so brave," they said. "You finally stood up for yourself." Lisa, my best friend since college, came over 3 days after the wedding. She brought wine and takeout and sat across from me at my kitchen table watching me push noodles around on my plate. "You did it," she said, smiling like she expected me to celebrate. "You finally stood up for yourself. Aren't you proud?" I stared at my tea gone cold in the cup. "I don't know what I feel." "What do you mean?" "I thought saying no would fix everything," I said quietly. "I thought exposing the truth would set me free. But I just feel tired." Lisa reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Do you regret it?" I thought about that for a long time before answering. "No, but I don't feel like I won either. I just feel like I broke something that was already broken." She stayed for another hour trying to comfort me, but I could tell she didn't understand. How could she? She had a mother who called her every Sunday just to chat. She had a family that celebrated her accomplishments and missed her when she was gone. She'd never had to fight for her place at the table. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in my mind. The white carnations filling the room, the recording of my mother's voice, Jessica's video, Mark taking off his boutonniere and walking away, and my mother collapsing into that chair, sobbing in a way I'd never seen before. The sound echoed in my head over and over until I finally gave up on sleep and got out of bed. At 3 a.m, I found myself standing in my bathroom, staring at my reflection in the mirror. I looked at the same face, same eyes, same dark circles from too many sleepless nights. But something inside me had fundamentally shifted, and I couldn't name it. I sat down on the cold tile floor, pulled my knees to my chest, and did something I'd never done before. I spoke aloud to myself. "I spent 38 years waiting for my mother to see me," I said to the empty room, "to tell me I was enough, to fight for me the way I fought for everyone else. And when she didn't, I thought destroying her perfect day would make me feel whole." My voice cracked, but I kept going. But here's the truth nobody tells you about revenge. It doesn't fill the hole. It just makes you realize the hole was never about them. It was about me. I was waiting for permission to love myself. Permission I thought only she could give. Tears started streaming down my face. But that night, when I said no to her, when I hung up the phone and chose myself for the first time, I wasn't destroying her. I was freeing me. And that's what terrifies me now. Because if I don't need her permission anymore, if I don't need her approval or her love or even her acknowledgement, who am I without the fight? I looked up at my reflection through blurred vision. I guess it's time to find out. 2 days later, my phone rang. Unknown number. But this time, I knew it wasn't my mother. I answered. "Anna!" Mark's voice was hoarse, like he'd been crying for days. "It's me." "I know. I'm sorry." The words came out broken. "I'm so fucking sorry for everything." I didn't say anything. I just listened. Jessica and I left the hotel that night and just kept driving. We're 2 states away now, staying with her cousin. We're not getting married. Not yet. Not until I figure out who I am without Mum's voice in my head. "That's good, Mark." "You were right," he said. "About everything. I was weak. I let her control me because I was scared of losing her, but I lost you instead, and I lost myself." He paused, and I could hear him struggling to breathe through tears. "Can we start over? Can you forgive me?" I closed my eyes and thought about the little boy who'd wanted to give me his toy car on my birthday, the teenager who'd gotten a car while I worked 3 jobs, the man who'd stood by while our mother destroyed me piece by piece because he didn't know how to be brave. "I can try," I said finally, "but Mark, I can't save you. You have to save yourself." "I know," he whispered, "and for the first time in my life, I think I'm ready to try." We talked for another 20 minutes. He told me about Jessica, about the babies, about the therapy he'd started, about how terrifying it was to realize he didn't know who he was outside of being our mother's son. When we finally hung up, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Not happiness, not closure, but something like hope. Some endings don't come with words. They come with presence. Aunt Rose's call came on a Thursday morning while I was getting ready for work. I almost didn't answer, but her name on the screen made me pause. Rose didn't call unless it was important. "Your mother collapsed the night after the wedding," she said without preamble. "She's in the hospital, high blood pressure, panic attack. She's stable now, but Anna," Rose's voice wavered, "she's asking for you." I stood in my bedroom, one shoe on, one shoe off, staring at my reflection in the closet mirror. "I don't know if I can do this, Rose." "I'm not asking you to forgive her," Rose said gently. "I'm just asking you to come. Whatever happens after that is up to you." I called in sick to work and drove to County General. The 40-minute drive felt both too long and too short. I rehearsed what I might say, then decided I wouldn't say anything at all. I'd just sit there, let her speak if she wanted to, and then leave. I owed her nothing, I reminded myself. Not even this visit. But when I walked into her hospital room and saw her lying there, small and frail against the white sheets, something in my chest cracked. She was clutching something in her hand. As I got closer, I saw it was a white carnation, withered and brown now, but unmistakably one of the flowers from the wedding. She must have taken it with her when she left. Our eyes met. Hers were red-rimmed and exhausted. Mine probably looked the same. No anger passed between us. No accusations. Just 2 women who'd spent 38 years fighting a war neither of them knew how to end. I sat down in the chair beside her bed. Neither of us spoke. The only sound was the steady beep of the heart monitor and the distant murmur of nurses in the hallway. 1 minute passed, then 2, then 5. The silence stretched so long I almost got up to leave. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to apologize, Anna." I looked at her, at this woman who'd shaped my entire life by refusing to be present in it. "Then don't apologize," I said quietly. "Just tell me the truth." She stared at the ceiling, tears sliding down her weathered cheeks and disappearing into the pillow. "Your father once asked me, why don't you hug Anna? I told him I didn't know how. He said start by letting her hug you. But I never did." I waited. She wasn't finished. "After David died, I held him for 6 hours before the doctors took him away. They kept saying, 'You need to let go, Mrs. Miller. You need to let us take him.' But I couldn't. And when they finally did," her voice broke, "I've been letting go ever since. I let go of you because I was terrified. If I held on too tight, if I loved you the way I loved him, I'd lose you too. So I pushed you away first. I thought distance would protect me from the pain. Did it? I asked. No. She looked at me, then really looked at me. It just made me lose you while you were still alive. I felt something loosen in my chest, but I wasn't done. There was one more question I needed to ask. Mum, did you blame Aunt Rose all these years for David's death? She was silent for so long. I thought she wouldn't answer, then barely audible no. Then why did you let her think you did? Her face crumbled. Fresh tears spilled over. Because if she believed it was her fault, then it wasn't mine. I leaned forward. What do you mean? She took a shaking breath and the words came out in a rush, like she'd been holding them for 40 years and couldn't contain them anymore. The night David died, before we got in the car, I was holding him. He'd been crying for hours. I was exhausted, overwhelmed. I was alone, and your father was out of town, and I just wanted him to stop. So I shook him, just a little, just to get him to stop crying. My blood went cold. When we got home, and he wasn't breathing, the first thing I thought was, I killed him. The shaking. It was me. The doctors said no. They said it was Sid's, nothing I did wrong. But I didn't believe them. How could I? And when Rose thought it was the car jolt when she blamed herself, her voice dropped to a whisper. I let her. Because as long as she blamed herself, I didn't have to face that maybe I was the one who... Stop. My voice was firm but not unkind. Mum, you didn't kill him. Sid's means no one's fault. The doctors told you that, but you didn't believe them, so you spent 40 years punishing everyone around you for something that never happened. She sobbed openly now, her whole body shaking with the weight of decades of guilt. You punished yourself. You punished me. You punished Mark. You punished Rose, all for a tragedy that no one caused. I reached out slowly and placed my hand over hers. But you let his death kill all of us. And that was a choice. She looked at our hands, hers wrinkled and spotted with age, mine younger but marked with its own scars. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry, Anna. I know, I said, and for the first time I believed she meant it. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It just makes room for tomorrow. 3 months after my mother confessed her deepest secret in that hospital room, Mark called and asked if we could meet. Not at a house or a restaurant, but at Riverside Park, the same place where Dad used to take us when we were kids. I hadn't been there in years. I arrived first and sat on a bench overlooking the water, watching ducks glide across the surface. When Mark appeared walking across the grass, with a weathered paper bag tucked under his arm, I barely recognised him. He'd lost weight, his face was thinner, and there was something different in his eyes, something clearer, more present. He sat down beside me without saying hello, just stared at the water for a moment. Then he set the paper bag between us. I found this in Mom's attic when I was helping her move to Aunt Rose's place, he said quietly. I think you need to see it. I opened the bag. Inside was a photo album, old and worn, the kind with sticky pages and a fake leather cover. I'd never seen it before. Dad kept it, Mark said. A whole separate album, just for you. Mum never knew. I opened it slowly. The first photo took my breath away. It was me at 5 years old sitting on Dad's shoulders, my face lit up with pure joy. He was looking up at me with the kind of love that needed no words. I had no memory of this moment, but seeing it now made my chest ache. I turned the page. There was my high school graduation. But this wasn't the official family photo Mum had framed and hung in the hallway, the one where she'd cropped Dad out, so it was just her, me and Mark. This was a different shot, taken from far in the background. Dad, standing alone, half hidden behind other families, his camera pointed at me. The next photo was from the day I got my first real job. I was standing outside the office building in a new suit I'd bought with my last paycheck from the diner, smiling nervously at the camera. But I hadn't known anyone was taking this picture. The angle was strange, shot through a window from across the street. Dad had gone there to photograph me because he hadn't been invited to celebrate. The last photo wasn't a photo at all. It was a handwritten note tucked into the final page. I recognized Dad's handwriting immediately. Anna, my pride. Mark, my hope. I loved you both equally. I just ran out of time to fix what I broke. I stared at those words until they blurred. Mark sat beside me in silence, letting me process. Why didn't he just talk to us? I finally asked, my voice breaking. Why didn't he just tell us he saw what was happening? Mark's voice was quiet. I think he was too ashamed. I closed the album and set it carefully on my lap. Remember that night you came to my house in the rain? I asked, 3 days before the wedding. Yeah. You said you knew what Mum was doing to me, that you'd always known. Mark nodded slowly. I did know, and I came that night to warn you, Anna. I wanted to tell you not to come to the wedding. Mum had this whole plan. If you showed up without paying, she was going to humiliate you in front of everyone. She told Jessica that if you made a scene, she'd use it as proof you were unstable. She was going to turn the whole family against you. I felt a chill. Then why didn't you warn me? His face crumpled. Because I was still too afraid. Even standing in the rain on your porch, I couldn't say the words. I just asked you to help me instead. He wiped his eyes roughly. But at the wedding, when that video played and I saw Jessica's face, she looked exactly like you did when we were kids. Scared, small, waiting for someone to save her. And I realised if I don't save her, I'm just like Dad, choosing silence over protection. I reached over and took his hand. You're not Dad, Mark. You walked out. You chose her. But it took me 32 years to do it. His voice was thick with shame. 32 years of watching you suffer while I stayed quiet. There's something else, Mark said after a long pause. He reached into the bag and pulled out a sealed envelope yellowed with age. I found this at the bottom of the album. It's addressed to Mum, but it was never sent. I read it. I think you should too. I took the envelope. My hand shook as I opened it and unfolded the letter inside. Dad's handwriting again, but messier this time, like he'd written it in a hurry or through tears. The letter was a confession. Dad wrote about the night I turned 8 when he'd confronted Mum about the way she treated me. She'd threatened to leave. She'd said she couldn't be the mother I needed, and if he forced her to try, she'd rather be gone than fail me every day. So he'd begged her to stay, and she did, but I lost her anyway. I chose you over her Evelyn, the letter read, and I've hated myself every day since. I was so afraid of losing you that I sacrificed our daughter to keep you. I'm dying now, and here's the truth I saw, Anna. I loved her, but I loved your brokenness more, and that's the worst thing a father can do. I read it twice, then I folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope. I sat there for a long time, staring at the water, feeling something shift inside me. Dad wasn't a hero, I said finally. He was just human, and flawed, and I think I need to forgive him too. Mark nodded, tears streaming down his face. Me too. We both do. We sat there on that bench for another hour, not saying much, just being together in a way we never had before. When we finally stood to leave, Mark pulled me into a hug, awkward and uncertain but real. Siblings aren't born, they're built one choice at a time. A week after my meeting with Mark, Aunt Rose asked if I'd help her go through the old family home before it went on the market. Mum was settled at Rose's place now, and there was no reason to keep the house where so much pain had lived for so long. I agreed, though I dreaded it. Walking through those rooms felt like touring a museum of my own grief. Rose and I spent most of the day in silence, sorting through decades of accumulated life. Old dishes, clothing that smelled like mothballs, furniture that no one wanted. Late in the afternoon, I went down to the basement to check the storage area. That's when I found it again. The tin box. The one Dad had labelled "For Anna when you need it." I'd found it once before 5 years ago, right after Dad died. But I'd only looked through it briefly, too raw from grief to really process what I was seeing. Now I sat on the cold basement floor and opened it again. Inside were the 17 letters I'd written to my mother during my first 2 years of college. I'd almost forgotten about them. I'd been so lonely back then, so desperate to feel connected to home. I'd written about everything, making the dean's list, my roommate troubles, the part-time job at the campus library, how much I missed Dad's pancakes on Sunday mornings. I unfolded them, one by one, reading my younger self's hopeful, vulnerable words. Mum had never replied to a single one, but Dad had kept them all, and beside each one in his small, neat handwriting were notes. Showed Evelyn. She read it and cried, but she won't write back. I don't know how to help her love you the way you need. The last letter I'd written was short, just a few lines. Mom, I made Dean's list again. Top 5% of my class. Do you think Dad would be proud? Below it, in Dad's handwriting, he is, I am, always. But there was something else, something I hadn't noticed before. Below Dad's words, in handwriting I barely recognised, shaky, faint, like it had been added much later, was a single line. I read all your letters, every one. I cried each time. I just didn't know what to say back. I'm sorry. Mum. I stared at those words until they blurred. She'd read them, she'd cried, but she still couldn't reach across the distance she'd created. I carefully placed the letters back in the box and carried it upstairs. Rose was in the kitchen wrapping dishes in newspaper. She looked up when I came in. Find anything? I held up the box. Everything. That night back at my own house, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those letters, about the girl I'd been at 19, still believing that if she just tried hard enough, she could earn her mother's love. I wanted to go back and tell her the truth, that she was enough, that she'd always been enough. So I did the next best thing. I opened my laptop and started writing. Dear 8-year-old Anna, I typed. I'm writing to you from 30 years in the future. You're sitting by the window right now, aren't you? Waiting for Mum to come say goodnight. And the words poured out of me everything I wished someone had told me back then. That the no I'd eventually say would be the most important word I'd ever speak. That love isn't supposed to hurt. That saying no to someone else's expectations is saying yes to my own life. That I didn't need anyone's permission to matter. I wrote until my eyes burned and my fingers ached. When I finally finished, I read it back and felt something shift in my chest. So tonight, when she doesn't come to say goodnight, say it to yourself, goodnight, Anna. You are enough. You always were. Because 30 years from now, I'll finally believe it. And I want you to start sooner. Love the woman you'll become. Lisa had been staying with me for a few days while her apartment was being renovated. She came into the kitchen in her pajamas, saw me crying at my laptop, and read over my shoulder. That's beautiful, she said softly. What are you going to do with it? I'm going to share it, I said, with Jessica, with her daughters when they're old enough, with every woman who's still waiting for permission to matter. Lisa squeezed my shoulder. I think a lot of people need to hear this. The next morning, I called my mother. She answered on the third ring, her voice uncertain. Anna? Mum, there's something I need to tell you. About Aunt Rose. Silence. She's been carrying guilt for 40 years, thinking she killed David. You need to tell her the truth, that it wasn't her fault. that it wasn't anyone's fault. Mum's voice was so small I could barely hear it. I can't. She'll hate me for letting her believe it all these years. She won't hate you, I said firmly, but you'll hate yourself less. And that's a start. I'm bringing Rose to visit you tomorrow afternoon. You're going to tell her, not for her, for you, because healing starts with honesty. Anna, I don't think I can. Yes, you can, because if you don't, you'll carry this guilt until the day you die. And so will she, and that's not fair to either of you. There was a long pause, then quietly, okay. 2:00 tomorrow. Rose and I will be there. After I hung up, I sat with my hands folded on the kitchen table, staring at the white carnations in the vase by the window. Dad's flowers, still blooming season after season, whether anyone noticed or not. Love doesn't need to be loud, it just needs to be there. 6 months after the wedding that never was, Aunt Rose called and asked if I'd come to dinner. Not just me, all of us. Mum, Mark, Jessica. A real family dinner. She said the kind we'd never actually had. I almost said no. Old instincts die hard. But something in Rose's voice made me pause. This wasn't about obligation or guilt. It was an invitation, not a summons. So, I said yes. I arrived at Rose's house just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Mark's car was already in the driveway. I took a deep breath before walking up to the door. Rose opened it with a warm smile and pulled me into a hug. I'm glad you came. The dining room table was set simply, no fancy china, no elaborate centerpiece. Just mismatched plates, cloth napkins, and a mason jar filled with white carnations in the center. Beside the flowers sat a small framed photo of Dad positioned in front of an empty chair. Rose had set a place for him too. Mum was already seated, her hands folded in her lap, looking smaller and older than I remembered. She'd aged in these 6 months, not just physically, but in the way she held herself. The rigid control was gone, replaced by something quieter, something almost like peace. Mark helped Jessica settle into a chair, his hand protective on her back. She was 8 months pregnant now, her belly round and full, and she glowed in a way that had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with finally being safe. She smiled when she saw me, and I smiled back. We ate together pot roast, mashed potatoes, green beans, the kind of simple food Rose had always made. The conversation was tentative at first, careful, like we were all learning a new language. But slowly it grew warmer. Mark told a story about Jessica's latest craving pickles with whipped cream. Jessica laughed and didn't try to hide her embarrassment. Rose asked about my work. Mum listened, present but not dominating. For the first time in my life, I sat at a table with my family and didn't feel like I was bracing for an attack. After dinner, Jessica asked if I'd step outside with her. We sat on Rose's porch, the evening air cool and soft around us. She looked at me with tears already forming in her eyes. Will you be their godmother? I stared at her stunned. Me, why? She smiled through her tears. Because you taught me how to say no to the wrong things, and I want you to teach them how to say yes to the right things, to themselves, to their dreams, to love without fear. My own tears came, then hot and sudden. Yes, of course, yes. We sat in silence for a moment, and then Jessica asked, what would you tell them when they're old enough to understand? I thought, carefully wanting to get the words right. I'd tell them that their worth isn't measured by what they give up. It's measured by what they refuse to lose. I tell them that people who truly love them won't make them choose between themselves and others, that they're not responsible for healing people who hurt them, that saying no doesn't make them selfish, it makes them honest. I paused, looking at her belly, and I tell them that their children will be watching, so show them that love means presence, not disappearance. Jessica pulled a small notebook from her pocket and wrote down every word, her hand moving quickly across the page. When she finished, she looked up at me. Thank you. You showed yourself it was possible, I said quietly. I just held up the mirror. When we came back inside, Mum was standing by the window, looking out at the darkening sky. I walked over to her slowly. We stood side by side for a moment, not speaking. Then she turned to me, and her voice was so quiet I almost didn't hear it. Anna, can I hug you? It was the first time she'd asked in 20 years. Maybe the first time she'd ever asked. I nodded, unable to speak. She stepped toward me and we embraced. It was awkward at first, neither of us quite remembering how to do this. But then something shifted. Her arms tightened slightly. My head rested against her shoulder. And we just stood there, breathing together. Two women who'd spent a lifetime fighting, finally choosing peace. I counted silently. 17 seconds. Long enough for something to change. Long enough for something new to begin. When we pulled apart, her eyes were wet. I should have done this 30 years ago. I touched her hand gently. We're doing it now. That's what matters. 2 weeks later, Jessica gave birth. A boy and a girl. Mark called me from the hospital, his voice breaking with joy. Her name is Grace, he said, after Grandma, and his name is David, after the brother we never got to know. 6 weeks after that, they got married at the courthouse. No elaborate ceremony, no crowd of guests. Just Rose Mum and me standing as witnesses. Jessica wore a simple white dress. Mark held her hand like he was afraid to let go. The judge pronounced them husband and wife, and we all cried. It was small, but it was real. Some families are born. Ours was built one forgiveness at a time. 5 years after Mark and Jessica stood in that small courthouse and promised to build something real, I drove to Riverside Cemetery on a sunny Saturday morning. The white carnations I'd cut from my garden lay on the passenger seat, their stems wrapped carefully in wet paper towels. I parked near the old oak tree and walked the familiar path to Dad's grave. The headstone was simple, just his name and dates, and below them, the words he'd asked for, he loved quietly. I knelt and placed the flowers at the base, arranging them carefully. "Hi, Dad," I said softly. "I brought someone." I heard footsteps on the grass behind me. When I turned, Mum was standing there, her hands clasped in front of her like a nervous child. She was 68 now, her hair completely white, her face lined with years of grief finally acknowledged. She'd been living with Rose for 5 years, going to therapy, doing the hard work of healing. But she'd never come here. Not once since the funeral. "I couldn't before," she said quietly, reading my thoughts. The guilt was too heavy. I stood and held out my hand. She took it, and together we walked to the grave. We sat down on the grass, side by side, not speaking. Her hand stayed in mine, and I held it gently, without hesitation. The silence stretched between us, but it wasn't the silence of avoidance anymore. It was the silence of two people who'd finally run out of words they needed to say, and found peace in what remained. After 10 minutes, Mum whispered, "I think he'd be proud of you." I looked at her, at this woman who'd caused me so much pain and who was trying finally to be better. "I think he'd be proud of us." She nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. We stayed there for another hour, just sitting with Dad, letting him know we'd found our way back to each other. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Time moved differently after that. The years didn't fly, they settled like dust after a storm, each one building quietly on the last. 10 years after that first family dinner at Rose's house, I stood in my backyard on a bright summer morning pruning the white carnations that had taken over half my garden. I was 53 now, my hair threaded with grey, my hands marked with soil and time. The garden had become my sanctuary, the place where I felt closest to Dad and closest to myself. "Auntie Anna," a voice called out, and I turned to see David running toward me, all knees and elbows, at 10 years old, his face lit with curiosity. "Why do you plant so many white flowers?" I set down my shears and knelt to his level, smiling. "Because someone once told me that these flowers bloom in silence. just like the strongest kind of love. And the best love doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be there. He thought about that for a moment, his face serious, then threw his arms around me in a hug that nearly knocked me over. I laughed and held him tight. From the porch, I could see Mum sitting in a rocking chair, 80 years old now, watching us with a peaceful smile. The anger that had consumed her for so long had finally burned out, leaving behind something softer. Mark and Jessica stood together near the fence, their arms around each other, still choosing each other every day. They were happy, free, whole. Grace David's twin sister came running over with a trowel in her hand. "Can I plant one too?" I handed her a bulb from the basket beside me. "Of course, you're going to do great things, Grace, and you'll never have to prove you're worthy of love, because you already are." She beamed at me and carefully dug a small hole in the soil. As I watched these children free from the burden of earning love, free to simply be, I thought about how far we'd all come. And I thought about all the women out there who are still waiting, still sacrificing, still trying to earn what should have been freely given. So here's what I want to say to you, whoever you are, wherever you're listening from. People always ask me, do you regret it? Ruining your brother's wedding. And I tell them the truth. I didn't ruin a wedding. I ended a lie. For 38 years, my family lived a lie that silence was safety, that sacrifice was love, that you had to earn the right to matter. And I almost died believing it. So here's what I want you to know, not from a place of anger, but from a place of peace. Your no is a complete sentence. You don't owe anyone an explanation for protecting yourself. Healing isn't linear, it's layered. One brave moment won't fix everything, but 1,000 small choices to choose yourself, those will. Forgiveness is for you, not them. It doesn't mean what they did was okay. It means what they did won't define you anymore. You can't save people who don't want to be saved. And trying will only break you. And finally, the life you want is on the other side of truth. Truth destroys what's false, but it reveals what's real. And real is always better than perfect. So if you're listening to this and you're tired of being the strong one, tired of giving more than you receive, tired of waiting for someone to choose you, here's my message. Choose yourself. Not because you're selfish, but because you're the only one who can. Say the no that scares you. Tell the truth even when it hurts. I ruined a wedding, but I saved a life, mine. And if my story helps even one person say no when they need to, then every moment of pain was worth it. Choose your self-love. The world needs you whole, not small. I stood in my garden surrounded by white carnations, watching David and Grace plant flowers that would bloom long after I was gone, and I knew finally, completely, that I was enough. I always had been. Thank you so much for staying with me through this entire journey. I know it wasn't easy to hear, and some parts probably hit closer to home than you expected. But that's exactly why I needed to share it. Because somewhere out there, someone is sitting in the same place I was, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 38 years ago, waiting for permission to choose themselves. And I want you to know that permission doesn't come from anyone else. It comes from you. If this story resonated with you, if you saw yourself in any part of Anna's journey, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Tell me what hit home. Tell me what you're struggling with. Tell me about the no you're scared to say. This community is built on honesty, and your story matters just as much as mine. You never know who needs to hear that they're not alone. And if you found value in this story, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that notification bell. I share stories like this every week, stories about real people facing real struggles, finding their way from pain to peace. These aren't just stories for entertainment. They're roadmaps for anyone who's ever felt invisible, unheard, or not enough. Before you go, I want to leave you with one final thought. That family dinner I talked about, the one where we all sat together and just existed without fighting, that didn't happen because someone apologized perfectly or because time healed all wounds. It happened because someone somewhere decided to tell the truth. And the truth is what set us all free. So here's my question for you. What truth are you ready to tell? Drop it in the comments. Let's start a conversation. Let's choose ourselves together. Until next time, remember this. You don't need to be small to be loved. You just need to be you. And that, my friend, is always enough. Take care of yourself. I'll see you in the next story.